Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast. My name is Paul Ellis, and I'm your host for these programs about developments in this fast-growing industry. Many claim that ESG is dead. Our Sustainable Finance Podcast guest today said that ESG is broken at the New York City Climate Week last year. But ESG teams need ESG software in the same way that finance teams need finance software. Makes sense, but where should businesses start on this software adoption journey? Today, followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast are going to hear from Marjella Lecourt-Alma, CEO and co-founder of Datamaran, about smart ESG, how it differs from other approaches, and what are the benefits for businesses of different sizes and industries. Datamaran is the only software analytics firm in the world that can monitor external risks and opportunities, including ESG, in real time. The development of their patented technology is expert-led and fully transparent. Marjella and the Datamaran team believe that companies who care about their success in an ever-evolving world incorporate material ESG risks and opportunities from the top down. Hello, Marjella, and welcome to the Sustainable Finance Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
It's a pleasure to have you join us today. We're really excited about this program, and we're going to jump right into the questions that we have for you. You ready?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Marjella, the regulatory pressure on ESG has increased dramatically with CSRD, CSDDD, California bills, US SEC climate disclosures. Are these regulations adding to the bureaucratic burden and getting in the way of achieving real-world impact?
It's a very good question, Paul. And I think initially a lot of folks working in the field of ESG were of the opinion that regulations wouldn't be what we needed, as in regulations will lower the bar instead of making companies ambitious as it comes to their ESG strategies. Interestingly enough, I think the opposite is occurring. So I would say regulations are our unexpected best friend at the minute.
Good.
As these regulations are actually pointing the finger, not so much at compliance, but really in terms of governance, in terms of ownership, in terms of leadership. So when you look at the regulatory developments, whether it is CSRD or CSDDD or the US SEC Climate Disclosure Act, all of it is about understanding when it comes to these new issues, these new business risks and opportunities, who's actually in charge? Who's driving this? How have you set up internally your governance system? So it's asking questions about how companies are getting organized around this rather than, I think, initially the expected box-ticking exercise. Once it gets to regulation, we get to the boundary of boredom and it gets to a check-the-box exercise, and actually the opposite has occurred.
Okay. Now, can you share an example at Datamaran with us without giving away any secrets about what any of these regulatory platforms what you've encountered in dealing with them?
Yeah. So actually, a lot of our clients, our new clients, come to us because of the regulatory pressure. And what has happened within these companies is that new leaders are getting involved. So we're seeing the general counsel or the CLO appear. We're seeing the CFO appear. So there's an interesting new collaboration happening at the C-suite level, also trying to answer to their board members and of course, investors on what they're doing in terms of ESG. And the first question they have is, Datamaran team, how can you help us get set up for success? And what do we need to do in terms of our governance? And who do we appoint? And yes, we had a CSR team in the past, but this team was involved in our CSR report, and they were involved perhaps in philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
but not so much in business strategy. So it's C-suite members realizing ESG is a governance issue, and it's an opportunity that is being presented to ESG leaders or CSR leaders or sustainability experts that have been on this for many, many years to actually step up and take a strategic role. And I think that's also very exciting.
That's very interesting. And thank you so much for sharing that. One of the complaints, right, that we've been hearing for several years now as we have been anticipating this regulatory infrastructure development was that the C-suite people at companies were not getting engaged, and they were handing it off to other parts of the business infrastructure. But what you're saying, it sounds like just the opposite is starting to happen now. That's terrific, and good news for Datamaran and lots of other companies as well, right?
Finally, right? But it is happening.
That's great. Glad to hear it. Now, what other external pressures are business leaders facing regarding corporate sustainability and ESG? And what internal obstacles must businesses overcome to build successful plans and achieve their goals?
Thank you for your questions. I think in terms of the first one, the external pressures, I would say there are two main things. The first trend that we're seeing is that everyone is asking. So a lot more people wanting to understand what companies are doing in terms of ESG and how they define it. There is no ESG one size fits all. So it's very much about companies getting ahead of it and trying to articulate what these issues mean to them, and what are the issues that they are prioritizing. And they're getting these questions across the board into multiple teams. Investor relations also being an obvious one today. And this also results in the ESG team or the sustainability team needing to show up everywhere to help answer these questions that are coming to companies in a much more frequent way. So we see clients talking about the need for becoming more agile when it comes to answering these questions around the ESG issues. Another one, external pressure, I would say is around finding and keeping the right talent for companies. So, of course, we all know that Gen Z is very different from previous generations and more, of course, aware of what is happening in business, much more mindful of the environment and also lifestyle and food, and also much more interested in getting this information straight away. So if you want to be attractive for new generations, the new talent that you want to attract to your companies, you have to have your story straight. It has to be compelling, and it has to be up to date. And you have to be in conversation with these new generations. In terms of the internal obstacles you talked about, I think there's really only one main internal obstacle that makes action on ESG difficult, and that is really about communication. So you might have your ESG team that has a very specific interpretation of what ESG disclosure and ESG strategy might look like. Now, what we're seeing today is that this has become a matter of the C-suite. These people are getting involved. They are responsible. They have to take ownership. And this is where we often find a literacy gap, not just with C-suite, but also with board members. And this is where I think everyone is playing catch up. I'm trying to understand what is all this stuff about? How do we make the first steps? And oftentimes what we see here is that before they make the first steps, they first have to pause because they have to learn and they have to understand what they don't know yet.
Okay, that's a very good place to enter the discussion of our next question, and that is, what role does technology play in overcoming these challenges at the C-suite level and all the way down to the folks who are doing things day in and day out to make sure that the company keeps running the same way and keep making progress?
Sure. I think the role of technology is pivotal here. On the one side, addressing, of course, the ESG skills gap and literacy gap. I think there is a role for technology companies to play to help scale expertise. And that's how we're looking at Datamaran. We've been building out use cases related to data-driven materiality, double materiality, ESG risk monitoring that typically consultants would do, or an in-house team. So a technology player can help scale expertise that is currently not readily available in the market and see how technology can be best tapped to do that. So we use AI, generative AI, all the new technologies available to make that happen. But also, I think, in general, right? Every well-respected business function should have a tech stack. And then also in terms of, using technology to get perhaps more confidence in your decision-making around ESG. When you use different technologies, and especially the ones that we use, you're able to analyze more data faster in a more replicable way. And I think that's also one of the great benefits of leveraging technology for ESG decision-making is that you can analyze thousands of regulations, thousands of reports, thousands of media analyses that would otherwise be humanly impossible. So lots of benefits.
Okay. Now, tell us a little bit about how businesses can leverage the advancements in artificial intelligence in your experience with your customers, because you work with many of the largest corporations in the world, and they have to have large staffs that are focusing on these technology advancements. How is that going?
Yeah, so a very specific example is, of course, businesses trying to evidence, oftentimes these are ESG leaders, trying to evidence to their C-suite teams or their boards why certain decisions are being proposed. And if they can do that on the basis of the fact that this is a data-driven practice now, rather than someone's opinion or a bunch of people's opinion, that really helps drive the change internally. So if you have the evidence looking at the regulatory landscape, the media landscape, and let's also say the reporting landscape as a proxy to industry trends, then you can present facts to stakeholders internally that otherwise might have said, that's just your opinion. So I think that's where AI particularly is very powerful. Another example, and that's a more recent one, is that what we're seeing is that especially C-suite leaders would like to have more hand-holding and more contextualization of ESG trends. So if we're, for instance, seeing that business and human rights is becoming a very big theme in a particular country, they are not just interested in understanding that is a trend. They want to understand why. So Gen AI in particular can be used to provide that narrative, that context. What am I actually looking at here? And I think for the longest time in our business, this is where we saw some limitations. And now with Gen AI and those trends, we see an opportunity to press ahead and for Gen AI to play more of the role of the consultant or the in-house experts that go beyond the graph or the table or the data visualization into explaining what it means and giving you the right context.
So Gen AI is now becoming an accepted part of business on a day-to-day basis, I think is what I hear you saying, even at the C-suite level in many companies. And I'm very excited to hear that. I know that I'm way behind the curve in terms of learning how to use it myself, and I've got a lot of catching up to do. So how does smart ESG help business leaders build trust with investors? Because now we're getting into the part of our discussion where we're starting to talk about capital deployment. And that is ultimately, as we all know, the bottom line. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a really good question. I think smart ESG, of course, it also alludes to it being tech-enabled. It would be obvious why Datamaran would say it, why it should be tech-enabled, but it's even more so in the approach. So if you are an investor, you very quickly understand that ESG is different from industry to industry, from country to country, and perhaps even very company specific. So when you do ESG right, and we call that smart ESG, is that you decide to focus. You focus on a key set of, let's call it material, or let's call them priority ESG risks and opportunities. But also, you're able to explain why you are deprioritizing a lot of these issues. And I think there's been a lot of backlash on ESG also is because everyone was trying to do everything. Let's try to cover as many ESG topics as possible, and then hopefully we'll end up high in all these ratings. And what we're seeing now is with this focus on governance and ownership and leadership and making choices, that smart ESG is really about narrowing it down and then doing that part right. So if that means that for you, that is climate risk, biodiversity, and talent retention, 3 issues, so be it. If you can defend why that is, and you can also defend why you're deciding to leave others behind, then that is your ESG strategy. Of course, one side note here is that there's, of course, the regulatory aspect of it as well. So part of ESG is companies making judgments, and part of ESG is also regulations starting to mandate certain issues, and in terms of those issues, then they're of course material to all.
Okay. Now, of course, there's another whole population that we need to integrate into this discussion, and that is the investors and the stakeholders. So how does smart ESG support investor relations and stakeholder engagement?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the investor and stakeholder engagement, smart ESG really helps business focus on the key issues that matter most. But also with smart ESG, we're essentially saying, take it in-house, make it your own. Do not outsource critical ESG matters outside of the business. And once your investors and your key stakeholders understand that you have properly integrated ESG into the key functions from the top down, obviously that's going to build a lot of trust, because then there is an understanding on the other side that you have properly invested in getting the skills, getting the tools, and also getting the focus, making the choices that make your business successful. So I think the biggest benefit of smart ESG when it comes to investor relations and stakeholder management is the ability to insource it, and then with a lot of confidence being able to talk about it.
Okay, so now ESG teams, we know, need ESG software in the same way that finance teams need finance software. This all makes sense. Where should businesses start on this software adoption journey today?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're hearing that a lot. I think here the most important realization before buying anything is realizing that with ESG, you don't need to do it all. And of course, there's going to be stories out there in the public domain that are going to tell you that ESG is very complex and you probably need an army of people to help you with it. So our advice here at Datamaran is you don't need to do it all. start with prioritizing the issues. When ESG is truly a strategy, you exclude stuff as much as you include it. So start with that. And then afterwards, invest in data collection software, invest in reporting software that will help streamline it all. But if you get the beginning right, if you get that focus right, you will not need to collect as much data, and you will also will not need to report out as much. So never start with data collection.
Okay, that's great advice, Marjella. We really appreciate it. And tell us where online followers of the Sustainable Finance Podcast can go to learn more about Datamaran's products and services that help leading businesses compete in the ongoing software adoption journey. And how can they reach you with questions about the topics that we've discussed in today's episode?
Great. So, of course, the website has a lot on there, www.datamaran.com. Also, we have a LinkedIn community that is led by Lottie Hawkins, so that can be found on LinkedIn. And, of course, we are around also at the conference scene, Greenbiz, Climate Week, New York, Reuters conferences, and you can reach out to any of us really on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you as we're building our community.
Terrific. Now, Marjella, we can also attach research papers, blogs, and links to webinars, etc., to our Bright Talk home location for these podcast programs. So if there's anything you'd like us to attach to this program, please send those links to us, and we'll be glad to do that. And thanks again, Marjella Lecourt-Alma and Datamaran, for joining us in today's Sustainable Finance Podcast episode. And our followers can join us again next week for another episode. My name is Paul Ellis, and this is the Sustainable Finance Podcast.